Maya and Sophie had always shared an unbreakable bond ever since they were little. Their parents marveled at how inseparable they were, as if one couldn't exist without the other. They shared everything: clothes, secrets, dreams, and an uncanny resemblance that had strangers doing double takes wherever they went. But lately, something unspoken lingered between them, something neither of them dared to address. It was as if their connection had deepened in a way that felt new, unfamiliar, and dangerously intimate. That evening, Maya was sprawled out on her bed, flipping through an old magazine, while Sophie sat cross-legged on the carpet, absent-mindedly doodling in her sketchbook. The soft glow of their bedside lamp cast long shadows on the walls, wrapping the room in a cocoon of warmth and quiet. Outside, the faint hum of the wind filled the silence between them, but no matter how much the room evolved, one thing remained constant. It was their shared sanctuary, a space where they could retreat from the world. Maya sat cross-legged on her bed, her fingers absent-mindedly twirling the loose strands of her long hair. She was the quieter of the two, the introspective one who preferred books and whispered conversations to the chaos of parties and crowds. Across the room, Sophie was sprawled on her stomach, flipping through an old photo album they'd rediscovered while tidying earlier in the day. "Do you remember this?" Sophie said, her voice carrying a playful lilt as she held up a photograph of the two of them at the beach. They couldn't have been older than 10, their identical features glowing with unfiltered joy. Maya smiled softly. "Of course. That was the summer we spent building sand castles and pretending we were queens of a magical kingdom. And this summer, you cried because a seagull stole your sandwich," Sophie teased, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Maya threw a pillow at her, unable to suppress her laughter. It was traumatic. That seagull was ruthless. The light-hearted moment filled the room, but was quickly replaced by a lingering silence. Sophie's laughter faded, her gaze drifting back to the photograph in her hands. There was something different in her expression now, an intensity that Maya had noticed more frequently in recent months. It wasn't the first time she'd felt it, that unspoken energy that seemed to tether them together in ways neither fully understood. "Maya," Sophie said softly, setting the album aside. She shifted to sit cross-legged, mirroring her sister's posture. "Do you ever feel like things between us are different? Do you ever think about how different we are from other sisters?" Maya looked up, a bit startled by the question. "What do you mean?" Sophie hesitated, twirling her pencil between her fingers. "I don't know. It's just, I feel like we're closer than most sisters, like we share something other people wouldn't understand." Maya tilted her head, her heart beginning to race. "Different how?" Her heart skipped a beat. Sophie stayed silent. "Maybe," Maya said cautiously, not meeting her sister's gaze. "But we've always been close. It's just who we are." Sophie set her sketchbook aside, leaning back on her hands. "Yeah, but it's more than that, isn't it? I don't know. I can't explain it." Maya's gaze dropped to her hands, her fingers fidgeting nervously. She knew exactly what Sophie was talking about because she felt it too. The way their touches lingered a moment too long, how their shared glances carried a weight they never used to. It was as if their bond had evolved into something more, something neither of them dared to name. "I've noticed it too," Maya said finally, her voice trembling. "But I don't know what it means. Why are you asking me this?" she added, her voice trembling. Sophie shrugged, though her expression betrayed her nonchalant facade. "I've just been thinking about it a lot lately, about us, about how I feel when I'm around you." Maya swallowed hard, her pulse quickening. She wanted to dismiss the conversation, to laugh it off as Sophie being overly sentimental, but she couldn't, not when her own feelings mirrored Sophie's so perfectly. "And how do you feel?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie hesitated for a moment before scooting closer. "Like I can't stop thinking about you," she admitted, her words rushed but sincere. "Like I miss you even when we're in the same room, like I want to be near you all the time." Maya's eyes widened, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Sophie could hear it. She opened her mouth to respond but found that no words would come. The truth she had buried so deeply was staring her in the face, and there was no denying it anymore. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken words. Sophie reached out, her fingers brushing against Maya's. The simple gesture sent a shiver through Maya's body, the warmth of Sophie's touch igniting something she couldn't quite name. "We're alone now," Sophie said, her voice barely audible. "Mom and Dad are out, and it's just us. Maybe we can figure out what this is together." Sophie reached out, her hand brushing against Maya. The touch was fleeting but electric, sending a jolt of something Maya couldn't name coursing through her. "Do you feel it too?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Maya nodded, her throat tight. "Yes," she whispered, "I feel it." But still, she hesitated, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. She looked up, meeting Sophie's gaze, and what she saw there took her breath away. It wasn't just love or affection, it was longing, raw and unfiltered. It mirrored the emotions Maya had tried so hard to bury, and seeing it reflected in Sophie's eyes made it impossible to deny. "Are you sure?" Maya asked, her voice shaky. Sophie nodded, her grip on Maya's hand tightening. "I've never been more sure of anything." Time seemed to slow as Sophie leaned closer, her movements tentative, giving Maya every opportunity to pull away. But Maya didn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in her chest as Sophie's face came closer, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. And then their lips met. It was soft at first, a tentative brush of skin against skin, but the emotions behind it were anything but hesitant. Maya's eyes fluttered shut as she leaned into the kiss, her hands finding their way to Sophie's arms. The warmth of her sister's touch, the way their lips moved together, it felt natural, like something that had always been meant to happen. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. Sophie's fingers traced patterns on Maya's arm, her touch gentle and soothing. "Does it feel wrong to you?" Sophie asked, her voice a whisper. Maya shook her head. "No," she said honestly. "It feels right." The admission hung between them, heavy and exhilarating. Sophie's fingers intertwined with Maya's, her touch warm and steady. Maya couldn't bring herself to pull away, even as her mind screamed at her to stop. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, their hands clasped together, their breaths mingling in the stillness. Maya felt as though the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only the two of them in this fragile, forbidden moment. "What do we do now?" Maya asked finally, her voice barely audible. Sophie's grip on her hand tightened. "I don't know," she said, "but it felt kind of good. I'd say we maybe just try it more often and see how it goes. But Mom and Dad can't know this, obviously." Maya nodded. "Yeah, you're right." Her heart swelling with a mix of fear and excitement. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. But the story didn't end there, because then, all of a sudden, Maya's chest tightened, a wave of regret washing over her. The weight of Sophie's words pressed down on her, pulling at something deep within. She tried to steady her breathing, but her pulse raced as if her body had already decided to throw caution to the wind. Maya pulled her hand away, albeit gently, letting her fingers trail against Sophie's. "Sophie, we can't," she faltered, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Can't what?" Sophie asked, her voice soft but unwavering. She wasn't challenging Maya, but there was a quiet determination in her tone, her gaze staying locked on Maya, searching for answers. Maya didn't know how to give. "Can't admit what we already know is true." Maya turned her head, breaking the connection between their eyes. She stared at the wall as though focusing on the peeling paint could save her from the emotions threatening to spill over. "It's not that simple," she said. "Why isn't it?" Sophie pressed, shifting even closer. She knew that this was just a temporary regret, and soon enough she would join her with even more passion. Maya felt the heat radiating from her sister's body, a reminder of how close they truly were, not just physically, but in every other way that mattered. Because it's not normal, Maya said, her voice shaky. She hated how the word sounded, as though she were condemning them both for feelings neither of them had chosen. Sophie let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. When have we ever cared about being normal? You and I, we've always been different, and you know what? I like it that way. I wouldn't want it any other way. Maya looked back at Sophie, her brow furrowed in confusion and frustration. But this, what if it changes everything? What if we ruin what we have? Sophie reached out again, her hand resting lightly on Maya's knee. The touch was grounding, as though Sophie was trying to pull Maya back from the ledge she teetered on. It's already changed, Maya. We both know it. The question is, do we ignore it and pretend everything's fine, or do we face it and figure out what it means? Maya hated how logical Sophie could be sometimes. Her sister had always been the bolder one, the one who pushed boundaries while Maya held back, afraid of what might happen if she stepped too far outside the lines. But this wasn't some rule they could bend or break. It was their entire relationship, their entire lives. I don't know, Maya admitted, her voice small. I don't know what to do. Sophie smiled gently, her hand giving Maya's knee a reassuring squeeze. Then let's not decide right now. Let's just be. We don't have to figure it all out tonight. Maya wanted to believe her, to take comfort in the idea that they could put everything on pause, but the tension between them was impossible to ignore. It thrummed in the air like an electric current, growing stronger with each passing second. Do you want me to leave? Sophie asked suddenly, her tone careful. Maya's head snapped up, her heart skipping a beat at the thought. No, she said, a little too quickly. She saw the flicker of surprise in Sophie's eyes and softened her voice. I mean, no, I don't want you to leave. Sophie's smile returned, and it was the kind of smile that made Maya feel like everything might actually be okay. Good, Sophie said, her tone lighter now, because I wasn't planning on going anywhere. Maya let out a soft laugh despite herself, the tension easing slightly. She leaned back against the headboard, watching, as Sophie settled in beside her. For a while, they sat in silence, the only sound the faint rustle of the wind outside. Do you remember when we were kids and we used to sneak out to watch the stars? Sophie asked, breaking the quiet. Maya smiled at the memory. Yeah, Mom and Dad would freak out if they caught us, but it was worth it. Of course it was, Sophie said, grinning. It was always worth it when we were together. Maya's chest ached at the simplicity of Sophie's words. It was true. They'd always been together, always been a team, and maybe that was why this was so hard. They weren't just sisters, they were each other's everything. Sophie shifted closer, her shoulder brushing against Maya's. It was such a small movement, but felt monumental. Maya's breath hitched as Sophie turned to face her, their eyes locking once more. Can I ask you something? Sophie said softly. Of course, Maya replied, her voice barely audible. Sophie hesitated, her gaze searching Maya's as though trying to gauge her reaction. Do you ever think about what it would be like if we weren't sisters? The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning. Maya's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of emotions and what-ifs. I don't know, she said finally, though it wasn't entirely true. I do, Sophie said quietly. I think about it all the time. Maya felt her heart clench at the confession. She wanted to say something to reassure Sophie or push her away, but she was frozen in place, trapped between her own conflicting emotions. Sometimes I wish we could just run away, Sophie continued, her voice barely above a whisper. Go somewhere no one knows us. Start over. Maya shook her head, though she wasn't sure if she was disagreeing with Sophie or trying to convince herself. That's not how life works, she said, her voice trembling. We can't just escape reality. Why not? Sophie asked, her tone earnest. Why can't we make our own reality? Maya didn't have an answer. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling beneath her feet, and yet, when she looked at Sophie, all she could see was the possibility of something she'd never allowed herself to imagine. "We should go to bed," Maya said suddenly, breaking the moment. Sophie didn't argue, she simply nodded, though the look in her eyes told Maya that the conversation was far from over. As Sophie stood and made her way to the door, she paused, glancing back at Maya. "Good night," Sophie said softly, her gaze lingering. "Good night," Maya replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The door closed behind Sophie, leaving Maya alone with her racing thoughts. She lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling as her mind replayed every word, every look, every touch. She couldn't shake the weight of Sophie's words. As she stared at the ceiling, the room felt colder, emptier, as though Sophie's absence had pulled all the warmth from it. She tossed and turned, her thoughts racing in circles, the idea of escaping reality, of creating a world where their bond wasn't questioned, lingered like a bittersweet melody in her mind. Her body ached with tension, her heart pounding as she thought of the way Sophie had looked at her. So raw, so unguarded. Maya pressed her palms to her face, trying to calm the storm inside her, but it was futile. With a soft sigh, she sat up, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that amplified every creak of the floorboards, every